Hi, in this video we're going to have a look at the next step in preparing the annual accounts workbook, and in particular we're looking at reviewing the client's response document and allocating data to the work paper, which is this step here in our checklist. What we would normally do when we receive a response document from a client is we would scan it and we'd save that scan under a folder in our year-end accounts template called PBC, which stands for Prepared by Client. We probably would also keep this, in fact reference this whole document as Workpaper Z2 so that we can reference them in later. So here is our Workpaper, our WhatSphere checklist, which I've just opened here. They've also sent me some additional documents. The one that we're going to want to look at later on is expenses. So we'll look at that in a few minutes. But let's just walk through what we're looking for in the annual accounts checklist. Most of the checklists will have at least the first page will be the checklist for the actual business itself, and then towards the end of the checklist there may be one or more checklists for individual members. In this particular case we have the checklist for Shane Fairbrother, individual return, and then they've also sent me in a separate PDF the document for Robin Fairbrother. Okay, so let's just go through what this is going to look like and where we're going to put the information into our workbook. Every client's going to be slightly different. These checklists get prepared based on the information we know about the client at the time we prepare the checklist, and so we're asking for certain bits of information that hopefully is going to be appropriate to the client, rather than giving the clients all the same checklist and them having to delete stuff they don't need. So basically your goal here is that as you work through this checklist, you want to make sure that you're copying every bit of information that the client gives us into the annual accounts workbook. So the first area we look at is bank statements. Now if they're in Xero or we've done GST work for them, we'll already have their bank transaction data, so we're not asking them for that. What we're asking them for is simply their bank statements at the end of the year. And the reason we're asking for that is that when we get to do the bank account, we want to agree the closing bank statement in the ledger to an actual bank statement balance. Now he's actually already given that to us, and I've already filed it in our year-end accounts under 2012 WhatSphere bank accounts. So I'm actually going to rename that to A2 bank accounts. We'll come back and look at that in the bank section. Okay, and you tick those all off. Under accounts receivable debtors, he's told us they have $7,500 GST inclusive worth of accounts receivable or debtors, and there's a schedule. If we go to schedule 1, here it is here. Here is the information for that client. So this is the first bit of information we're going to copy into our workbook. We're going to go to our debtor schedule, which is schedule B, and we are going to this information, NZRB, New Zealand Racing Board, and we're going to say that this is from Z2 and it's $6,900, which is actually 6,000 plus 900 GST. And Bernardo's Z2 is 500. Actually that's not quite right, is it? I'll use those formulas there. Okay, so there's the net amount, the total including GST, and here's the gross amount before GST. And the reason that's important is when it comes to journal this, we're going to want to journal the gross amount of revenue, not necessarily just the net amount. And we're also going to want to make sure that when it comes to our GST reconciliation, that we know how to account for the GST on the unreceived debtors and creditors. Okay, so first thing we've done here is we've copied in the information from the accounts receivable section or question into our workbook. Okay, now as you're going through this, if you have an annotate tool on your PDF viewer program, feel free to actually tick off as you go and possibly even put the reference numbering in here of the page that you put this information on. It's more for your benefit than anything else, but it also helps me later on know that you've actually seen it and done it, because I will have to go through and review this document as we go. Under accounts payable creditors, they've said there are no creditors. I actually know that there's at least one, which we'll find later on, but that means there's nothing for us to enter. If they did give us anything, we would actually go to our creditor section, workpaper N, and either create a separate schedule or enter in this information here. One of the things we could put it in is simply say as per client schedule, and then just total up the gross GST and the net amounts over here as well. That's perfectly okay. Wherever we are in these workbooks, you don't have to retype something that is clearly presented in another medium. So if we already have a spreadsheet, or it's already in a fax or a scanned document in this case, we don't have to retype it, at least in detail, unless we have a particular reason to. So in this case, there's nothing to type, so we just don't even have to bother putting anything in. Next section is cash on hand. They've said no cash on hand, which we expect for this kind of business, so we'll simply pass on that. If they did have cash on hand, we'd go back to our bank section, and we'd probably actually have put a line in here under the in funds section for cash on hand, which would be, obviously in our case, be 0. Okay, next section we look at is stock on hand. That's going to be in our other current assets section, Schedule C, and here we have a section for inventory or stock, where we might type in some information. We've already got the comparative year information here, and what we know here is he's actually already said 0, so we can enter in 0 if we want to. Next section in this checklist is capital expenditure, and this is really asking them for any information about things that might affect our fixed assets schedule. And so if there's any information on here about fixed assets, you would probably just copy it over, maybe even just make a brief note somewhere down here so that you know when to come back to it, that something may have happened. For example, they may have said that something's been sold, and you might come over here and say, yes, they've sold the personal computer. Best thing to do right now is maybe just add a note to this particular line, because you don't want to go and delete anything till you've got all the information you want. But here you might simply say insert comment and say per Z2, which is the checklist, client advises this was sold on whatever date. Okay, and just leave that there so that when you come back to the schedule later on, you've got the reference that you need to look at it. Next one here is transactions not through the business, and this is for anything where the client has advised us that they need to get reimbursed or recorded the fact that they paid some money and it didn't go through a business bank account. Now this is where the client has actually told us that there were some transactions, and so here's a schedule of those transactions, and we would normally want to include these in the other current liabilities accruals, which is workpaper 01. That's where we create the accrual for unreimbursed expenses. Now this is a bit too large to copy straight into this workpaper, so what we might want to make a note of here is that see client schedule, and we're going to call this Z, I'll make it 05. That's the next workpaper in the O range that's available to us, and we're actually then going to save this. It's important to make sure that if you do reference it in, that you put it here straight away. Where did it go? Year-end accounts, there it is. 05. Unreimbursed expenses. Okay, we don't necessarily have to evaluate or assess this information right now. We are simply looking to make sure the information provided to us by the client has been referenced onto this workpaper, so that when we come to evaluate the workpaper, we're going to find it later on, because we don't really want to have to keep coming backwards and forwards to this document all the time. The next is legal and loan documents, and here we're looking for any indication that the client has been in any form of legal involvement that might require us to change things in the accounts. These could be a court action, could be that they have bought or sold a business, or other such things, in which case the client has said not applicable, so we can skip over that. Again, if there were, you'd be looking for anything relating to fixed assets, and you make a comment on the fixed asset schedule, or other forms of long-term investments or long-term loans would also impact this area as well. If you do see stuff here, probably best to let me know. Next is business expenses, And what we're often asking for here is obviously copies of legal fees, copies of ACC payments, and copies of insurance premiums that help us decide if we need to accrue or defer large portions of income. Now, this particular client doesn't have any insurance, and they have not paid ACC during the year. You can see I've made a note of that already, that we might need to go back and look at that, and we'll see that when we find the rest of their documents later on. Under the donations, if the business has made donations during the year, we want some information on that, and he has said that they haven't made any cash donations during the year. Private use of assets. They have said no private use. If there is private use of assets, we would need to do additional calculations, and you probably want to alert me on that one there. Expenses paid in cash or from personal funds. That's actually the same question as this one here. Transactions not through the business, although I think this one's aimed more at sales income not banked, whereas this one is expenses, as we've already recorded that over here. Next one is the motor vehicle expenses, and this is work paper X2, and this is really used when a client has a motor vehicle that is not in the business, and so we might be using what's called a share of use percentage. So here what we've confirmed is the car is in the personal name for 2012, and we're going to do a general provision of 200 business kilometres. So in fact we're going to go up here and simply say 200 business kilometres, and just put total of 200 kilometres here, and that's going to calculate our mileage claim for us automatically. Okay, if there was more information than that, we would copy this information here. Total business use divided by total use will give us the percentage on business. This worksheet here only provides for one car, whereas the checklist actually assumes that it's up to two. If they had this, we would also then be looking at the vehicle expenses, which is the section up here, which we haven't actually asked in this checklist. We'd have to then go back and ask them for more information if it wasn't already in the ledger. Again, we'll come back to this later on. Again, remember here, our goal is to simply copy the information off this checklist into the appropriate place in our workbook. Next section is home office expenses, and here we copy this into worksheet X1. We are looking to know the amount of use of the home, so area used for business divided by total area of house or workshop, and if we had that from the prior year, we would have already entered that into here. Then we ask the client to give us the totals that they've spent during the year on these types of home office expenses, which we would then put into this column here, and the spreadsheet would actually give us, and this one down here would actually calculate for us the amount of our claim as well, which we'll come back to again later on. Okay, so what we've done now is, as far as the business portion of this checklist is concerned, we'll ignore the individual portion right now. We have now gone through the entire checklist and transposed all the relevant information or added comments where necessary into this work paper. At this point, if there's anything you knew that appeared to be missing, if they hadn't answered a question and you were pretty sure they needed to, you would come over to the questions tab and you would write down what it is you want to email the client. Now, my advice here is in this questions column is you actually write it now the way you'd like to say it to the client. So rather than just say cash on hand missing, you would say please advise the amount of cash on hand at the end of the year, because that makes it easy later on to simply copy and paste this range of cells and paste it into your email document without having to then go through and retype everything. Okay, so as you're going through this checklist, if you're finding things that you need to ask a question on, okay, so when I first received this with a client, I actually reviewed it with them, and I said, oh, we need to update the amounts of accounts receivable, and then actually a few minutes later we fixed it, so we crossed it out. I noticed that he did say, oh, you know what, I do have some transactions that haven't gone through the business. They were actually the expenses, not the income, and so he's since sent that to me and we can cross that one off. And we noticed that he hadn't sent me the ACC information, so in fact he still hasn't done that. So what we actually need is we need to request the ACC information. Now, because I know he doesn't have that, and he hasn't paid it, so we're going to have to request it straight from ACC. It's not going to need to go to the client for follow-up. We'll pick that up naturally when we go and do the rest of our checklists. So we've now done this. We've logged all the information off this checklist into the appropriate page in the workbook using direct data entry or comments, and now we're ready to sign off that we've done that step here. So now we can say, yes, I have completed this step of the process. And what that means now is that for the most part that we won't need to come back and open up that document again, because all the information we need has now been copied into this section of the workbook. Now we're ready to go in section by section and actually look at each individual account.